4th, 2025, and coming to you live from northern Israel. Today, here in Israel, it is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it is a day of great solemnity, obviously, a solemn day of thinking, obviously, about the Holocaust and all the terrible tragedy that it brought onto the world, and doing things. There are a lot of ceremonies, there are a lot of people who read stories, poems, histories. They perform music, all kinds of performances. And then, of course, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Israel time, the entire nation stops what it's doing for 2 minutes and stands in silence to mourn for the victims of the Holocaust. Now, of course, does not apply to uh, soldiers who may be actively engaged in combat, or policemen who may be actively engaged in hot pursuit of some crime, or maybe actively engaged in just in stopping a crime, or firefighters who may be actively putting out a fire, or ambulance drivers who may be rushing to save a life, EMTs, anything that involves saving a life or defending a life. Those people, may be uh, engaged in other activities, but pretty much everyone else could be the head chef in a big fancy restaurant making a fancy meal for a big fancy bunch of guests. It could be the head of a bank in a big meeting. It could be street sweeper, school teacher, carpenter, plumber, electrician, office worker, secretary to the president himself. It doesn't matter what, right? At 11 o'clock in the morning, the country stops what it's doing and stands in silence for 2 minutes as a siren blares over the country. And now you may ask yourself, well, I heard that Israel has sirens when there's rocket attacks. Well, what happens if there's a rocket attack siren during the 2 minute siren? Well, that's a very good question. So, what happens during the 2 minute siren if, God forbid, there's actually a rocket attack during that time? Which, by the way, that has happened in some areas of the country over the years. And because, of course, right, why would the enemies of Israel not attack Israel during 2 minutes when we remember those who fell at the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust? You're talking about enemies, today's enemies, who have the same ideology, the same exact, literally Mein Kampf ideology. Like you gotta remember the actual book by Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, right? His sort of autobiography, is a top-selling book throughout the Arab world historically. Right, when it was first translated from German, one of the very first languages they translated it to, was Arabic. Why? Because they knew it would be a top seller, and it was, and it's been part of their curriculum throughout the Arab world in many different places, not just in the Palestinian schools in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. No. In Iraq, in Syria, back in the day in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, Mein Kampf was a super popular book. In Lebanon, and many places. Lebanon, after the Shias took over, when it was still Christian, they weren't such big fans of it. What a shocker! But yeah, the Arab world has long liked that book. Wonder why? Could it be that they have the exact same ideology? They just have a different religion? Yeah, pretty much. They both have an ideology of absolute hatred and scapegoating of the Jews, and a desire to exterminate the Jews from the face of the earth for the crime of being born Jewish. That's literally what that comes down to. And that's why the Holocaust happened, right? Because the Nazis felt the compulsion to try to eliminate Jews from the earth for the crime of having been born Jewish. That's it. There was no other, you gotta understand, there was no other people targeted purely by their religion, targeted for extermination by the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis killed all kinds of people. In fact, they killed, if you add up the numbers, right, they killed like if 20 million Russians died, right? Jews only 6 million died. So obviously the number of Russians dead dwarfs the number of Jews dead. Yes, but the difference is the Russians were not targeted and brutalized and murdered in concentration camps and death camps and by Nuremberg laws, humiliated and beaten and tortured and raped and murdered and incinerated, gassed to death, all these horrible things that the Nazis did to the Jewish people, specifically because they were just born Jewish. And yes, they did do all those terrible things to lesser degrees to people of different minorities, meaning in smaller quantities, to handicapped people. Can you imagine that? To children who happen to either, obviously Jewish children, yes, but like also children who happen to be children of handicapped parents. They would just murder their children. Well, they'd go, well, we're not going to have orphans to handicapped parents who are, who we killed. So we're just going to kill their kids too. They would kill handicapped children. They would kill, people of color, right? They would kill gypsies just because they happen to be not pure Aryans, which is ironic because actually gypsies are more Aryan than the Germans. What I mean by that is if you look at where the original gypsies come from, they come from India. Guess where the term Aryan comes from originally? That the Germans culturally appropriated and bastardized, just like they did with the swastika symbol, right? Which the Germans did not invent. All the Nazi culture did was take the swastika and turn it about 45 degrees, right? So it like points up and down and to the side as opposed to sitting like a square, okay? So there's a lot of things that the Germans culturally appropriated, actually. The Nazi Germans, I'm not talking, I'm talking about the Third Reich and the Nazi Germans. A lot of things they culturally appropriated. Hello to you. That they used as weapons against the Jewish people, obviously, primarily because that's who they literally targeted for extermination. But they also used them against other people. And we can't forget that in total, something like 40 million people or so. I mean, it's an insane amount of people that died as a result of the war and the Holocaust, right? I mean, again, like 20 million Russians died because of the Holocaust. I mean, because of World War II, sorry. 6 million Jews died in World War II because of the Holocaust. What does Holocaust mean, by the way? Do you know? If you don't know, originally, Holocaust, Holocaust, or however you pronounce it in ancient Greek, is a burnt offering that people would make to the gods. For example, the gods of the underworld. They would sacrifice the quote-unquote dark animals, and they would, the gods of the underworld would accept them and then consume them by burning them completely. So they were sacrificial animals. And so the original meaning of Holocaust is literally to destroy a sacrifice, especially by fire. It could be a nuclear holocaust, it could be a nuclear explosion, but it can also be a Holocaust like what we had in World War II, where Jews were killed, obviously by fire, um, obviously by gas ovens. They were incinerated in massive ovens, and they were killed by by showers, chemical poison showers, and then their bodies would be incinerated in gas ovens or in ovens. Um, yeah, so they were murdered in gas chambers, burnt in ovens. Um, but obviously, there were many other ways that Jews were just killed, shot, you know, brutalized in countless ways that you can imagine. And that, you know, all together was a kind of not a redefinition, but like it gave kind of permanent definition of the word Holocaust. So it took the original word, which was a mass slaughter, you know, often by fire. If we're talking about the ancient times, there was a mass slaughter, like intentional mass slaughter, and Holocaust became the word synonymous with the mass slaughter of the Jewish people that was intentional and was aimed at ridding at first all of Europe of every trace of Jewish existence. Right, that was the goal. They wanted to completely get rid of anything Jewish in Europe, like 100%. They wanted to leave no Jew alive across Europe, and then eventually they wanted, Hitler's bloodlust dreams, much like Hamas. I mean, literally, they're identical. Was that eventually there would be no Jews left on the face of the earth, which is why Haj Amin al-Husseini, the so-called leader, even though he wasn't elected or anything, and he wasn't a king or a prime minister, he was just a religious leader. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian, the Arab who lived in British Mandate Palestine, who was in charge of the religion of the Muslims here at the time, was in Jerusalem, and he was a horribly anti-Semitic person who forged relationships with none other than Adolf Hitler himself. And he went to Berlin and spent a lot of time there during World War II. And there he met with Hitler on a number of occasions, and they spoke at length about how to solve the quote-unquote Jewish problem right here in British Mandate Palestine, which is now Israel, right? And the British and the Germans basically, Haj Amin al-Husseini and the Germans, the Nazis specifically, and Hitler specifically, had agreed that after the Germans or the Nazis had killed all the Jews in Germany and Europe, that they would then bring their same methodology here to kill all the Jews living in British Mandate Palestine. Like literally, they wanted to build concentration camps and death camps here. They wanted to implement Nuremberg-style laws here. They wanted to destroy every trace of Jewish history right here in the ancestral homeland of the Jews. Worse than the Romans had done, worse than the Greeks had done, worse than the Persians had done. They wanted to, or the Babylonians, they wanted to completely eliminate every trace of Jewish existence right here in the homeland of the Jewish people, if you can imagine that. It means like all the buildings in Jerusalem would have to be, all the ancient buildings, all the historical stuff would have to be razed to the ground, right? Everything about the entire existence of Jews, destroy it. And by the way, the Arabs made a lot of quote-unquote progress on that front in their disgusting ways. Between 1935 and 1967 in the areas of Judea and Samaria and in East Jerusalem, right, which is obviously part of that era, for example, they used the gravestones of Jewish cemeteries that they still had control over to build hotels. Right? There's the Intercontinental Hotel, famously in Jerusalem, the Intercontinental Hotel to this day, where people stay to this day, where people pay money to sleep in and stay to this very day, has Jewish gravestones as part of its building. Jewish gravestones that were stolen from Jewish graves, obviously, by the Arab construction workers who built the hotel. And to this day, they leave them there in the hotel, as if nothing is unusual about it. Obviously, it's a hotel chain I would never stay at. I know people do. And well, that's your choice. And all I gotta say is it says a lot more about you than you think. Supporting a business that uses the gravestones of people whose graves were vandalized by the construction workers that made the hotel. Yeah, no, that's not a hotel I could sleep in. Thank you. I frankly don't understand why the Jewish government of Israel, right, the Israeli government, the Jewish majority, obviously, why they haven't, by law, demanded that that hotel be torn asunder and the company be forced to pay reparations to those families, or to replace the gravestones at the very least, and do all kinds of things to make good on the horrible crime that that hotel benefited from and still does to this day. But that's the world we live in. Messed up, and that's how it is. Anyway, guys, so on this day again in Israel in 2025, so like I said, there's a different kind of siren that sounds if, God forbid, there should be an attack during a siren, either on Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day today. We have a siren again at 11 a.m. Israel time. A week from now, we have another day of mourning where we remember the people who fell during war or battle or terrorist attacks. It's called Yom HaZikaron, or Remembrance Day, or Memorial Day, really. And on that day, we also have a siren that blares. We actually have two, one in the evening and one in the daytime. And during that minute of silence as well, if there's an attack, God forbid, that requires a siren to go off, there's a different sound in the siren. So, just in case you were wondering, if you ever happen to be in Israel and you hear the long siren that doesn't change note, it just raises, and it just kind of rings like a one note once it achieves the high pitch that it makes. It just rings for 2 minutes. That's the siren for Holocaust Remembrance Day, or when you hear that ringing on Yom HaZikaron, that's the siren of Yom HaZikaron. And then if you hear the one that goes up and down and up and down, that's the one for the rocket attacks. So that's how you know. Lovely things to think about. I know, kind of heavy stuff. But yeah, not every topic is lighthearted in the world we live in, right? And I thought originally I might tell you more about my personal ties to the victims of the Holocaust, etc. As I grew up my whole life, literally hearing about it as a child from a parent who literally lived through that. On one side, my parents, one of my parents lived through that. On the other side, one of my parents lived through the reality of being a Jew born in Egypt, which is a very, like, at the time of the king, and then eventually Gamal Abdel Nasser. Gamal Abdel Nasser kicked out all the Jews from Egypt in the 50s. But anyway, I wanted to speak more to you about the significance of the day overall to people in general, and the different kinds of sirens for historical archival reasons. If you ever look this up, what was it like in 2025 on Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel? Well, now you have at least one little glimpse into it that you can look up. In 2025, the people of Israel were still very much at war with some of their most insane neighbors, including the Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, also in Gaza, and many criminal gangs in Gaza, as well as the Houthis in Yemen. And technically, there's a ceasefire now with Hezbollah. Technically, the ceasefire actually ended, but it sort of still exists in Lebanon. So it's a hodgepodge of conflict happening here in the muddled East. And far be it from us to try to whitewash it, because we won't do that. So schools ceremonies where they read Holocaust Remembrance Day as well. The most extremists really. There's some factions that don't, by the way, which is weird, but you're always going to get weird outliers. But in most schools, they do, and some of the religious schools observe Holocaust Remembrance Day by reading stories and poems and singing songs in Yiddish, because they speak Yiddish in religious schools. Of course, they also speak Hebrew, but in very, very Orthodox communities in Israel, Yiddish is their first language, even though it's not an official language in Israel for various reasons. Yiddish, by the way, was never banned in Israel, contrary to bureaucratic beliefs across Europe. Like, there's literally a website on the EU website. There's a web page, like on the .eu government website, that claims that Hebrew was banned in Yiddish was banned in Israel. That's just actually not true at all. Yiddish was never banned in Israel. Yiddish simply was not formally endorsed, and it was even actively discouraged by the educational authorities, who wanted Hebrew to be the language of the country. So they wanted for a while that Hebrew would be the main focus in terms of the language. So a lot of Yiddish speakers did not teach their children Yiddish, because they were like, okay, well, the government wants us to focus on Hebrew, so we'll focus on Hebrew. But then they saw that their kids weren't able to speak with their parents or grandparents in their original language. And then through the popularization of klezmer music and other things about Yiddish culture, they realized, well, hang on, we better not lose this language. There's a lot of rich cultural tradition and history here. Let's do what we can to keep it alive. And that's exactly what happened, which is why you now have a kind of popular trend among certain groups of people in reviving Yiddish language and culture. And to be honest, I think that's wonderful. I never understood why anybody would be against language and culture, if that language and culture isn't like just some hateful, awful thing. And Yiddish is a lovely, fun, beautiful language. It's light, and it's, in many ways, it's humorous in many, many ways. It's a brilliant language. It's basically the Hebrew version of German, or the German version of Hebrew originally, and then obviously there are many other dialects that are not German. There's Romanian Yiddish, there's Polish Yiddish, there's Hungarian Yiddish. Basically, Yiddish is Jewish, right? This Yiddish means Jewish in German. It's like a Jew. It's like a word for Jewish, right? Yiddish. Um, and there are many forms of Yiddish, right, or Yiddish. Many forms of it exist, which were targeted by, again, the Nazis during the Holocaust. The language itself was targeted for extinction. No joke. Like, Nazis wanted to get rid of the language of Yiddish, as well as the language of Hebrew. Like, they hated anything to do with Jews at all. So that included Yiddish, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. What do you mean they wanted to exterminate a language? Yeah, no, they wanted to exterminate a language. And they attempted to. And they got bloody close. You got to admit, for all their failings, one thing they were very effective at was killing Jews and Jewish culture. And they almost completed their mission had it not been for the brave fighters and armies of the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, Denmark. Not only would we all be speaking German, but there would be no Jews at all. Nor would the millions of other Jewish people alive today. There would obviously not be a state of Israel. And so many inventions, scientific discoveries, etc., that have been made in the last 80 to 90 years or so since Adolf Hitler took control of Germany in the 1930s. So many of those things would not have come to reality, at least not the way that they did. Would you still have mobile phones? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe not. Innovation gets squashed in a country run by a complete dictatorship. Now, of course, you could also say, well, how long would Hitler have lived? And then what would happen? Hitler's aim was to build an empire that would last 1,000 years. I mean, he said it all the time, right? He wanted to mimic the Romans in that sense. He wanted to make a 1,000-year-long empire of Nazis rule over the world. And why would he stop at 1,000 years, right? If you could set up an empire that'll last 5,000, 10,000 years, why wouldn't you do that? Outlive his. Once Hitler would go friendly Germany the way it was in the 1920s and 30s before Hitler came to power. No. He wanted to obliterate. Start with the Jews, yeah, and lots of other minorities. And then take over the rest of the world. And then implement a German vision, an Aryan vision for the rest of the world. And live in a very orderly German hellhole for the rest of his life. And then hopefully, that what he wanted to do was he hoped to leave that kind of Germany to whoever would be following him with brutal efficiency, even if it meant killing 10. Seeing as it is Holocaust Memorial Day here, and there is going to be, if you come to a standstill for 2 minutes, literally, like, cars and buses on the roads will stop. Drivers will get out of their cars. If the bus is completely packed and there's no room for them to move, or they will, literally stand in the aisle. Sometimes they go out of the bus and stand next to the bus on the side of the road, but usually they'll just stand in the bus if it's a full bus, obviously. But cars, will stop on the highway. Drivers will get out of their cars and stand in silence. People walking down the street will stop walking. People, even in offices, will just stop what they're working on and stand for 2 minutes in silence to remember the fallen victims of the Holocaust, which is frankly a right and beautiful thing to do. Very powerful. To see it is to comprehend the significance, the depth to which the people of Israel and the Jewish people are affected by the events of the Holocaust, obviously, which nearly wiped out every last trace of Jews across Europe. So, on that note, I wish you all a wonderful, beautiful, peaceful, loving, happy day full of life and health and happiness where possible. Remember, just because the Jewish people are victims of the Holocaust does not mean we live as victims throughout our life. The great lesson for the Jewish people of the Holocaust, and frankly of every tragedy that the Jewish people have suffered throughout history, is that we turn our losses into wins in time by surviving, grieving, mourning, yes, all of that. And then eventually, by turning things around, adapting to the new reality, and thriving. That is the Jewish way, right? Like, quite literally, that is the Jewish way, right? Jews are famous for surviving in the face of utter devastation, imminent destruction. And then not just surviving it, but thriving in it. That is the way we have always done things. So, yes, it is darkest before dawn. And we remember that, and that keeps us going to the dawn and beyond. Anyway, with that said, I bid you all a wonderful day. And like I said, as dark as it is, as dark a day as it is, when you think about the horrors of the Holocaust, remember, we are now beyond that, and the Jewish people remember that forever. We say never again. And now with what happened on October 7th, 2023, we say never again is now, because it's an active threat of genocide that was launched against us. They attempted to genocide. Of course, yes, you can say they never had a chance to actually genocide the whole nation, but they wanted to. That was their goal, right? To kill as many Jews and people in Israel as possible. They didn't care if they were Jewish or not. They did, yes, of course, they wanted to kill as many Jews as possible, but they killed lots of non-Jews too. And they kidnapped lots of non-Jews too, including Arab Muslims, including, Thai people who had nothing to do with this conflict, who just were in Israel working as agricultural workers in farms, literally. They don't care. We're talking about terrorists who were just savage, murderous bastards. Sorry to put it that way, but evil people. Anyway, so yeah, we deal with that reality here in Israel, and we survive and we thrive, because that is the way that we do things, right? This country has been thriving for a long time because it's a country full of people who are diligent and work very well. They put a lot of effort into their work. Sometimes it may not seem like that, but they do put a lot of effort into their work to try to make a better future for themselves and their children and their children's children, as any country and people and nation should. So that's the message of peace and hope and love from here in Israel. And I bid you all a wonderful day. Shalom.